Welcome to the Powerhouse Project, a podcast empowering and celebrating women, and more importantly, an opportunity to share our stories. I'm your host, Lisa Laronde. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Miranda Steele, a strategic communications executive, an entrepreneur, and the president of Ellevate Toronto. It's a women's network dedicated to changing the culture of business. Miranda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited about this conversation.
Oh, I'm very excited. I'm excited to actually learn more about Ellevate Toronto and your experiences in changing business culture. I'm sure we're just going to have so much in common, but I wanted to start a little, just the beginning, just to get to know you a little bit, and then if you wouldn't mind engaging me in the business culture, because I think that's just an important topic for me, as well as I'm sure of people that are listening to the podcast. So what actually inspired you to begin your career in strategic communications? And actually, even how would you describe your strategic communications?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you look back probably at your, childhood, where you came from, your roots, you probably always see the signs of why you ended up where you ended up. I think I've always been a writer. I've always been, full of interest in, words. I think my mom used to always tell me that I needed to stop using 25-cent words when a 5-cent word was going to do just fine. And I've always been a dot connector, somebody who really wants to kind of figure out the patterns, how to put things together and tell a bigger story with the smaller things that are happening around me. And so, when I kind of look at those pieces, it feels really natural to say that I've landed in strategic communications. But for me, that's really all about storytelling and bringing pieces together to make more of, to take all of those small pieces and make them whole and make them bigger, whether that's, helping a leader like yourself with all of the ways that they show up in the world to have an even greater impact, whether it's helping a brand manage their reputation, figure out how to turn their, employee engagement and their ESG platform and how they manage issues into one holistic way to be. All of those things together are really what I think about when I think about strategic communications and how we can tell bigger stories that have a bigger impact in the world.
That's awesome. I mean, it's a very, very interesting topic for me. You have an extensive background, and I think we first connected on LinkedIn, and I believe you were working with global brands. I believe you were working with McDonald's. Is that
Yeah.
correct? And so what was that experience like?
Yeah, for sure. So I have about a 25-year career in corporate, first in telecom for about a decade, really focused on Canada. And then I spent a decade leading corporate relations for McDonald's in Canada, which was just an amazing opportunity. I joined when the company was on the beginning of a turnaround. If you're Canadian and you think about McDonald's, you might think about coffee, which is something that's actually quite exceptional in the world of McDonald's. And so we had a leader at the time who really just had a vision for how coffee was going to turn the business around. And I got to work alongside him in bringing that to life. And it was such an amazing experience. And so I spent 10 years kind of building on that with McDonald's in Canada, oversaw communications, government relations, an increasing ESG footprint. And then I was able to step into the international side of the McDonald's business and spent about 4 years working on the global brand, which my team oversaw corporate relations in 80 countries around the world. So really focused on Asia, Middle East, Africa, South America, and then pockets of Europe, which was so fascinating. What I always tell people kept me at McDonald's as long as it did was that there were no 2 days the same, and everything that happened in the world happened at McDonald's. And so that just kept it so interesting. And it's a company that just has some phenomenal people, and really never a dull moment.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the coffee because I read, and maybe this, I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but that Tim Hortons, the company that actually sold the coffee into Tim Hortons, actually they had a falling out, and now the producers of the coffee actually sell to McDonald's, which is why McDonald's coffee is tasting so much better these days than in the previous days. So, do you have any insight? Is that accurate?
I think there's a little bit of myth and a little nugget of
That's
truth in there
interesting.
somewhere, as
I
there
love that.
often is. But yeah, no, sorry. The coffee story at McDonald's is pretty great. The one thing that actually people don't talk about, because I think people want to hear a great story about
Yeah.
who the new provider is or what the magic is. I think one of
Yeah.
the big things that made a real difference was really just consistency and actually training the people to do, so that you knew when you were getting a cup of coffee at,
Yeah.
the McDonald's in, Stouffville or the McDonald's in Timmins, like you were getting that same reliable cup of coffee. And so that's kind of like the, a little bit unsexy side of this story that actually made a massive difference out there. Yeah.
That's incredible. So when you were part of the global brands, did you travel throughout Asia and
I did. Yeah, I did a lot of travel in that role. So it was, I had a team who were based in Singapore, Dubai, London, and then pockets in the US as well. And so whether it was traveling to see them, traveling to spend time with the markets that we were serving, or bringing everybody together for, team meetings, and our headquarters was in Chicago. So it did involve a lot of travel and just a lot of opportunities to really get in the field and see what was happening with the brand on the ground.
so then were you based
I
like
was
were
based
you
in Toronto.
oh you're based in Toronto, so, and then you just traveled to the
Yeah.
other. So would you see any cultural change? I mean, obviously you would. So what was your give me some kind of, just either stories or experiences that you had just traveling to different countries and what your experience was like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the McDonald's brand is a really interesting one to work on globally because, everybody has an opinion about McDonald's. It's a brand everybody has some sort of experience with, and that totally varies wildly around the world. In some markets, it's perceived as like a lower end fast food kind of option. In other parts of the world, it is a treat that you proudly and excitedly take your family out for. The restaurants themselves can be quite different. There's business partners around the world who are investing in the brand, and it is
Yeah.
such a point of pride for them. So, a business owner in the Middle East might invest a lot more money in the materials in their restaurant, in, marble floors, like things you'd never
Wow.
imagine in North
Yeah.
America, where it's like, how reusable can we make this bench? Because
Yeah.
at 3 in the morning, the wear and tear that it is going to get is a very different thing than, like
Definitely.
a Sunday morning family get together that's happening in a different part of the world. The food is also quite different. Like McDonald's has, a core menu around the world. There are certain things you're always going to be able to get. They're going to, look and feel like that taste of home that you're familiar with. But then there are things like, in Malaysia, I think it was like nasi lemak, or like whatever the, local breakfast of like chicken and egg and rice. It's
Yeah.
delicious, and McDonald's makes it like it. So it's really quite interesting. I did a lot of traveling and a lot of eating in that role.
It's funny. My daughter was in Taiwan, and so we arrived. She was still teaching, and so she said, "There's a coffee shop down the road that they speak a little bit of English if you want to get a coffee, or the McDonald's." So those are the two places to go without her at this point in time. So we went to the first coffee shop, and we could not get across what we wanted. It was
Right.
quite hysterical because there's not a lot of tourism in the area that she was in. So we ended up going to the McDonald's. So it's funny you say that. And they had a whole espresso cappuccino section, and it's funny because we started to go. We were only there for about 5 days, but they actually knew us. So the next day we came in, and then somebody be saying cappuccino, and it was just so they were just such nice people. But I agree with you. We've been to China, and it's the same idea that sometimes you actually walk into sit down restaurants. It really is a different vibe.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting how we always make these assumptions that everything is going to be the same. So I agree, maybe the quality of food or some of the foods that they carry. But
Yeah.
again, I guess it all speaks to culture.
And I
Um, Go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think one of the things that was so interesting and different too was, that's kind of the external side. But for me, what's always interesting too is the internal piece. And
Yeah.
so, how as a team who, all working on, common mission for a common brand, but dealing with really different day-to-day realities of how you're managing stakeholders, how you're involved in different parts of the business. And all of that has cultural nuances and implications as well. And I think, working for a big American brand
Yeah.
who does have local ownership and, local presence around the world, like you're also always trying to, at least in my role, I was always doing a lot of explaining and a lot of bridging. So a lot of really trying to help people see what's the same, but also really what's different. And so, that is a great marketing idea, or that is a reasonable way to think about managing this issue that's come up. But like, here's some watch outs, or here's some things that we hadn't necessarily thought about, or
Yeah.
a reason that actually we can't go ahead with what you're thinking. And I think that, I often used to say, like, we kind of sometimes would make our own geopolitics
That's
because it'd
awesome.
be like, one country doing something that to them was super,
Yeah.
natural, progressive, amazing opportunity, but things travel, especially, in today's world, like nothing really stays isolated. And so it's really hard to do things that have local impact without them also having a global impact at the same time.
Now, would you work with predominantly uh, teams of men, or did you, were there a lot of women teams, or what was your experience with women in
Yeah.
leadership?
So it's really quite varied. I think there's a couple of different like pieces I would share. When I joined the Canadian business, this was about 15 years ago, and it's amazing to see how things have changed in that time. When I joined, I was one of the few women in the room. I was definitely at an earlier stage in my career. And that was, very much like a male executive environment. Now looking at that team and the team that I was part of when I left, I mean, so much more diversity of
Yeah.
perspective, diversity, across all the different lenses that you would want there to be. And so, really like encouraging to see how those rooms are continuing to change. On the global side of the business, I think communications and PR are often a female dominated
Yeah.
profession. And so, I led and was part of teams that were pretty much all women, um,
That's
which
very
was
cool.
actually, every experience has its pros and cons, but that was probably the first time I had been part of a team of all women.
So
And
how was that?
it was amazing.
Oh, that's
I
awesome.
mean, it was what was amazing about it was probably the first time in my career that I didn't feel like it really mattered that I was a
Yeah.
woman in the room.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
I think when you're used to being the other at the table in some capacity, like you can't not be aware of that. And every idea you bring forward and every conversation you have and every way you show up feels like, am I going to ruin this for all the others who I'm representing?
Yeah.
And how are people going to see me? And, was this reaction because my idea wasn't good, or because I presented it in a way that, didn't connect, and was that because I am who I am? And so I think what was so freeing about being part of a team of all women was like we were just so focused on the work, like, and we had a great time too, but like there was just this dynamic of like that entire weight that you often don't know you're carrying, like
Yeah.
it was just not in the room. And so that was really, I think, just a great piece of perspective to be able to like work through, but also to carry with me now and know kind of the difference and how that feels. On the flip side, our very female team was often the only in the room when, sharing or persuading or,
Yeah.
influencing with a lot of our other stakeholders. And so I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition too. And that often caused, and certainly in different parts of the world, that was received differently. And
Definitely.
that's complicated.
I know we had Meg Mass on the podcast, and she's an openly transgender woman, and the story that resonates, and I'm telling it all the time because I just think it's hysterical. And actually, it's probably not funny. It's unfortunate, but it just resonates with me that on Friday she transitioned over the weekend. So on Monday when she came into work,
Right.
she's at a board meeting and they're exchanging ideas and stuff, and her ideas don't go anywhere. And the guy who was at the meeting last week with the same people. Basically presents her idea and then it gets accepted. And I started to laugh when I go, and it's only because of like how you're presenting. It's not about who you are or what you're saying. But I've told this story numerous times now, and it was interesting. Something you said today was maybe it's the way that it's being presented that it's not people aren't hearing the ideas, and so I'm starting to actually have a different perspective on that. Is you know it is nothing to do with I mean obviously it is something to do with our gender, but I think maybe it is something the way that we're being way the words are being received, which is an interesting concept that I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah. I think there's something to that. I mean, I do, my initial reaction though is that I do think it is still influenced by
Yeah,
gender, and that I think as women, and this is a generalization, but I'll make it
yeah, yeah,
anyway. But
yeah,
but I
yeah. I'm
do
with you.
think, you're so used to not expecting everybody to take everything you say. Like you're always trying and listening to how other people do it, and like I think you're aware of it, where I do think when you're, I think for, again, generalizing, but some of the men in business who have that expectation of leadership, or who have sort of, come into that like legacy understanding of what being a male leader might look like. I think that lens, they've never needed that lens.
Yeah,
And so I think it is true. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's like another piece of unconscious bias, where
yeah.
having to actually try and listen, um, and acknowledge that, actually there's great ideas out there, like you might need to put a different listening lens on to be able to find them, and that is part of your role, and that is part of how you advance business, and how, like, I think that is just a, I think that maybe is something that can continue to develop.
Yeah, and I, I've always been a little bit frustrated that, you have to either, or the perception is you have to work harder, or that women do work harder, or they work longer, to get to the same place where men are, and that's, I think that's always frustrated me, is why is the way that we look, or that we present, why does that have an impact on our ability to, lead teams or solve problems, or and I think women just bring a different perspective to the table. And it's interesting because I had one panel discussion, or I was like keynote speaker, and the room was basically 98% women. And I actually said to them, I'm intimidated. This is the very first time I have been in front of a group of women. All of my conversations in my industry are all for men. And everybody was laughing. I said, but just a different perspective when people actually, understand what you're talking about,
Yeah.
or have, traveled a little bit in your shoes, or, or maybe something I say resonates with them because this is what they've been exposed to. And I think now, as I'm trying to, get allies to come with us, and now I'm starting to say things, you don't know what it's like to be a woman in this industry, or just to, um, deal in some of the meetings that I'm in that has nothing to do with what I'm saying, or my ideas. It strictly has something to do with what I look like. So it's just an interesting dynamic for me. So how are you the founder of the Women's Network?
So I'm the president of the Toronto chapter of
Okay.
Ellevate Women's Network. Yeah, so it's a global network. I have to get the current number, but chapters around the world, predominantly in the U.S., but also chapters in Dubai, in Europe, and so we're one of the international chapters based out of Canada. And it's I joined about 4 years ago, and I've been president for the last year and a half now. But I've been with a number of women's networks across my career, both at McDonald's, where I led the women's network in Canada, also had a lot to do with my team, and just general like leadership within the international networks. And even when I was back in telecom at TELUS, I was part of their women's network as well. So I've seen a lot of internal networks, and then Ellevate is one of the like is an external network that I've been part of for the last few years.
And it's interesting. I actually did. I was part of a TELUS's. It was like Women in Construction Week, or sorry,
Mhm.
what it was just, they are so far ahead in
Yeah.
terms of their internal resources, and just how they recognize allies, and what they've done for women. So what would be your take on what we can do as, organizations or businesses that don't have the resources that somewhere like a McDonald's or a TELUS has,
Yeah.
to be able to either support women that are trying to move up in leadership, or how we can even support one another, or form, and maybe a networking group, so that we can actually share our stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a ton that we can do. I mean, it's part of what I love about Ellevate Network is that it is industry agnostic and it's level agnostic. And, the access to the, like, our events are very accessible. We offer a lot of virtual events that are, you know, low cost or free. And then we offer, in-person events that are also like really, quite accessible to people who want to come and join. And I think that to me is really different than some of the internal networks that I've been part of. I think
Yeah.
they serve two really different purposes. I think with some of the internal networks, I think they're incredibly well intended. And I think there are some organizations who do a fabulous job. But I also think there's always an element of like, you're wearing your job while you're there. And
Yes.
so, no matter who you are in the room, it's not really a safe space. Like you are still whoever you are in your day job, you
Yeah.
are still trying to climb whatever ladder or lattice you are, currently on.
Yeah.
And, I think sometimes that gets a little lost. And I also think there's a lot of pressure on organizations to demonstrate their DEI metrics.
Yeah.
And I think women's networks often kind of fall victim to like a check in the box and, are we doing it? And often the women are like, what are we doing this for? Like,
Yeah.
and yet the women are the ones doing the work. So that's been some of my experience kind of in-house, and where I think an organization like Ellevate does a really nice job is it is purely about making authentic connections and hearing stories and learning from others. And, I do think that that's a little bit different. Even some of the other, external networks that are really heavily corporately membered, I think those can often feel like, you have to be at a certain place in your career or
Yeah.
have a certain paycheck or a certain organization who's willing to foot the bill to join.
Yeah.
And part of what I like about Ellevate is that it is so grassroots that it really is, an opportunity for everybody. And that has been a little bit different for me and part of why I have a lot of heart for it.
I think that's awesome. I know I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Women in Construction, and we're trying to attract and retain women into the skilled trades. And we were at an event, a gala, and there was a Minister Williams was there, and so she asked in the audience, how many of you are, that actually are on the tools? And there was, maybe out of the 500 people that were there, a smattering of people. And then we started to talk about that. You got to think about it, which is exactly what you said. Is if you're in the trades, you're probably part of a union. You're probably not a full-time employee, and you may be, but to actually ask your employer to fund your ticket to go to the event, it's probably not happening as people that are at these higher levels or middle management or even higher that, probably get companies to pay for that. So it's interesting that, we're all trying to promote women in skilled trades, women in leadership, but really we're not. I don't think we're inclusive. I know it's a bad thing to say, but it's hard to get these people to come out
Yeah.
to some of your events if they're not at the right phase. So do you feel like Ellevate has done that or is starting to do that?
I think Ellevate definitely is trying to do that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
I think some of where sometimes it's hard to do the good you want to do, and there's also money
Yeah.
on the line, and it is a
Yeah. I know.
it is a
Yeah.
for-profit organization. But what I appreciate about it is that our mantra, and especially from a Toronto chapter standpoint, has really been are we are we breaking even, or are we making money that we can reinvest in our community and our events? And that's really the goal. And so we're not trying to create profit, we're trying to create community. And I think that is what feels a little bit more authentic to me about it, and why I feel so like passionate about telling other people to come to our events and join, because it really isn't, like nobody's getting rich off it,
Yeah.
which, headquarters might come after me for saying that. I don't think is, but that's not the point. And I think
Yeah.
that's where some of it gets lost when it's, can we tick a box? Can we drive another stream of revenue?
Yeah.
Like DEI is great business, but DEI shouldn't be a line item in your business. Like, so I think that nuance is part of where, I want to see things go, and why I have a lot of heart for building community that feels like it's not about a bottom line, but it's really just about connecting people, hearing from others. And I also really like that it's industry agnostic, because I do think that,
Yeah.
and I've worked in a few different industries, and I think there's something to learn from all of them, but I think we have so much more in common across industry, across role, across life experience. And when you only hear in one place, it's easy to think like, oh, this is just this just applies to us, or this is only our problem, or and I think back on some of the earlier things that I struggled with in my career. I often felt like the work I was doing, the role I was in, it was so confidential, proprietary. I was chief of staff to somebody very senior. I felt like I really needed to kind of like keep it all under wraps.
Right.
And if I had had a team, like if I had had a, a people and a community at the
Yeah.
time, I think I would have been in a really different position to, to manage and to grow. And so, I really want that for other professionals now.
And I feel the same way when I started in this role, and that I talk a lot about that is I really needed a community, just people that, and you didn't necessarily have to be in my industry, but somebody that was, in this leadership role so that I could just share some of my stories. And really, I think just sometimes to hear the sound of my own voice to understand whether, is this something seriously that we should be dealing with? Is this something that I can let go? What have you been exposed to? And I think if we can share our stories and our challenges and our journeys, and then people understand that, we can overcome them. And then together we can, I think create solutions and ideas. Because now what I say is we need to educate. We need to educate people to understand when you have women in these roles, in any role, just the behaviors that were acceptable, 10, 15 years ago just aren't anymore. But
Yeah.
but you don't know that unless somebody actually says to you, hey, that we don't do
Yeah.
this anymore, or this isn't appropriate.
Mhm.
As I said, we every day we should be learning something, and it's not, I'm not trying to call people out, but I think the more that we share our stories of what's happened to us or what's
Yeah.
happening to us now, I think the more people don't feel alone. So I think what you said about, you finding a community is just, it's just so important
Yeah.
to particularly women. And I like the fact that it's now, you can look at any industry, because when I talked about construction, the more people that I've talked to, we all have exactly the same. It's funny, we all have exactly the same issues. So it's not truly only in the male dominated or the, male led industries. It's across the board.
For sure. I love the story that you told about, and I think it was like you sort of called somebody out in a meeting
Yeah.
for, and I love that story because I really think there's so much the idea of, it's great to be polite and to go behind the scenes and make sure that nobody feels threatened. And when somebody has done something that, kind of sets the wrong tone or isn't something that should be tolerated anymore. But I think that there needs to be more of that too, because I think when we only have conversations one on one, we only have them behind the
Yeah.
scenes and we don't actually share, then I also think it normalizes. Sometimes people
Yeah.
misstep. And like it's okay to misstep and hear about it from a colleague and come back to the meeting the next day and do better. Like
Yeah.
I think, I feel like having those conversations in plain sight helps more than feeling like it's always got to be behind the scenes. Because I actually think that's been part of the problem too, is that, it feels like, I you mentioned also being known for your eye roll. Like
Yeah.
I very much was known for my lack of poker face. And for a number of years I tried very hard to have a poker face. And then, I kind of got over it. And like
Yeah.
I think I do have a poker face when I want to.
Yeah.
But sometimes I actually don't really think that it's warranted. Like sometimes I
Yeah.
want people to know that actually I'm not fully in alignment, or,
Yeah.
I want to talk more about this. And I want you to hear that I have a different opinion. And I think when we're always trying to, be nice and,
Yeah.
be liked, and it's hard not to be liked, but I do think, that's something that, and I say this like as a woman for sure, like I worry way more about being liked than I think men do in the workplace. And, they worry about, getting the job done. And
Yeah.
it's okay if that, comes with a little bit of, of rub, but I think
Well,
the
it's interesting because,
Mhm.
yeah, and it's interesting when I went through the executive coaching and you do the 360. So, you do your own evaluation and then what everybody thinks of you. And so she goes, "Oh, well, here's your differentiators." I go, "I know that." And she's laughing, and I'm going, I get how people take me. That's not who I am as a person, but I get that I come across that way. And sometimes
Yeah.
it's really important that I come across that way. I think it's important that exactly what you're saying. I don't want to be nice. I don't need to be nice. I don't need to say, "Hey, please don't do that again." I want to say, "Fuck you, you're an asshole," because that's the truth. And maybe that's a harsh way to come across. And my life partner will say exactly the same thing. But I go, at some point, you got to put yourself in my shoes, that I'm the recipient to all of this stuff.
Right.
And at some point, it has to stop. And yes, I could be, "Hey, please don't do this in the future." And I could find a nicer way to do that. And I'm not saying that that's the wrong way to go. But you have to also say to me, it's okay that I'm frustrated, I'm fed up, and I think I deserve the opportunity to say, "Hey, um,
I think
really,
as
you're
a
an
leader,
asshole."
And I think as a leader, knowing when you want to play both of
Yeah,
those cards is exactly like, but having permission
yeah,
to like that people will hear when you do both, and them knowing that like as a leader, it was warranted for you to
yeah,
like I think that that is where and I really do think like being able to do that and like have all of these perspectives and behaviors normalized is part of the value of a community of women who can talk openly about, you know what, I felt like I overstepped, but actually here's the impact it had. And, you know, like people see me differently because I feel comfortable saying what I needed to say. And like, you know, being able to test things out in a safe space
yeah.
is, I think, a huge piece of what's valuable about having a women's network and a group that that you can do that in.
I agree, and I think that as women, we have different challenges when we're going through this leadership role, and even as recently as last week, I had someone say to me, Lisa, I'm one of your biggest fans, and I really like what you're doing on the podcast, and I like that you're your unapologetic self. But can you tone it down a little bit? I was like, hey, wait a minute. That's oppressive. Like at some point you have to recognize you can't say on one hand you think what I'm doing is a really good thing, but then, you just you don't, I'm a little bit over the line. Anyway, I was laughing and I said, you know what, I'm still dealing with it. So I can imagine if I and what I try to talk to the next generation, this young generation coming up, is to say, if you're going to believe all the bad things that people say, then you got to believe all the good things that people say
Yeah.
about you equally. And that doesn't always happen. I think that's a traditionally women thing. But I said you got to stop to some degree caring what people think about you. I mean, I think you have to be true to yourself, and your core values. And
Mhm.
obviously, I think you need to be nice to people. But I really do believe you need to listen to your own internal voice, and you can't always change for what the business world wants you to look or to sound like.
Yeah, I think that I give similar advice to women when I think about, you know, I mentioned like when I first joined McDonald's and I was the only woman and I was early in my career, and I was working in like an advisory role to, you know, very senior, to the president of the company at the time, who had an executive team that was entirely male and really like, you know, tenured, seasoned, like fantastic leaders, but who weren't used to having a woman in the room. And
Yeah.
it definitely was a new dynamic that, I was very sensitive to. And I think there was definitely a feeling of like, you know, who does she think she is? Like, you know, like why? And, you know, I definitely think that I want to believe some of that has and is changed. You know, I think I wouldn't be in the same position today. Um, but I do think, you know, at the
But do you
time,
think that's because you have experience now and you're older? Like, do you think that that's because I agree with you, but I'm
yeah,
not sure now whether it's just that I think I can. I don't know. I don't know if it's because I have more confidence. I'm
yeah,
curious to.
yeah, no, I think, I mean, well, partly I want to think that there wouldn't be the same, you know, very homogenous leadership team around the table.
Yeah.
So maybe that, I think that's part of it, you know, because at the time I was encouraged to do a 360, you know, get everybody's feedback. And then I was encouraged to, you know, have a mentor. And it was somebody who was really liked by, you know, everybody in the organization. And you know, there were just a lot of things about it that when I look back on it, I'm like, this is such like an old
Yeah.
school way of helping a woman be a woman in business
Yeah. To fit
and
in.
fit in.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was like, you know, and I had a really great boss at the time who was just like, this is bullshit. And he
Yeah.
was like,
That's awesome.
you know, like, but there was, you know, if I wanted to succeed, there was definitely a lot of meeting in the middle, and the middle was somewhere probably a lot less in the middle than I
Yeah.
thought the middle should
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
But I do think, you know, and that I think is the value of, you know, like diversity around a table, because you don't have, hopefully, you don't have one person whose experience is the outlier. everybody has something different that they're bringing to
Yeah,
the table. You're not having a team of, really homogenous thinkers who have very similar experience and a very similar background. And that then anybody else who comes in is rubbing people in, whether it's a wrong way or a new way or
yeah,
something that they are, that they don't understand and they don't have a reference point. I found early in my career, a lot of the senior men I worked with, their reference point to having, a woman in decision making conversations was a wife or a daughter.
yeah,
And, so you often get, treated like
yeah,
a wife or a daughter. And like,
yeah,
we don't have enough time to talk about all the things about that that are not okay. um, and so I really do believe that a lot of that wouldn't feel the same today, because
yeah,
I feel like that moment, I really do believe, like, I feel like that moment has, at least in, not everywhere, but in enough places that now I think it's a lot easier to call out when something feels like, hey, you might not have meant it like this, but I need to tell you how that feels to me. Like, and, how can we work together in a way that, really reflects the fact that we're colleagues here? And, like, I think those conversations, and some of it is definitely just because I'm, at a different place in my career
yeah,
and, a different age and stage. But I also, when I talk to, younger people in my, the women's network who have been on teams I lead, like, they're so much less tolerant of things today.
yes,
And I think that is phenomenal. Like,
yeah.
I want I want them to have all the space in the world to make it right and make it comfortable. And I have a lot of confidence that that is going to happen.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I was holding out for this Gen Z generation to come up that actually, went to school and have been exposed to so much more, and they travel so much more. So now you're exposed to different cultures, and you have a really interesting perspective when you actually travel to different countries, and then you can understand how things work. But it's interesting. I was talking to a young, she's a lawyer, 27 years old, said, went to Queen's University in Kingston and had lots of women in her university, lots of women in her law school cohort, and then chose a law firm that had lots of women partners. And then she said the first time that she actually so didn't have any of this preconceived about working in even predominantly male-led industries or any of that, because had just grown up and had traveled globally as well, so had a lot of experience. And then she says she gets her first client, and he goes, "I don't want you to represent me because you're a young woman, and the judge isn't going to take you seriously." So she goes, "I don't. It didn't happen throughout all of this time, but actually now it's my clients." And so I'm like, you know what? We haven't actually prepared this generation to say there's still a lot of people that have not changed and that we tolerate, and whether that's, a grandfather or say, they're too old, they're not going to change. And I still think that partially through telling our stories and sharing our journey, that at least they understand it, that it will change. It's just going to take some time.
Yeah. I that story both gives me like hope and also like
I, I know, I
um
know,
but
I know,
yeah, no, and I think, I mean, unfortunately the work isn't done, and
I
I
know.
think that that's the reality. I mean, you see it every day.
Yeah,
I definitely don't think that, well, I know it's not finished. um but I do think there's a lot of progress,
yes,
and I think that telling our stories and having open spaces to share and talk about it is a huge, huge part of making that change. Because when we all just keep it to ourselves and
yeah,
meet people in the middle, which is not really the middle,
correct.
um,
Yeah, I
you
love
know,
that.
the line doesn't move the way it needs to. And I think when we actually like come out and say like, hey, this thing happened to me, I wish I had been bolder. I wish I had,
Yeah.
told people, but I wasn't in a position to do that. And so, knowing people are still, as they're starting their career, not in a position to, put their foot down and still continue to grow and succeed. Like, how do we create spaces and communities that empower everybody to, draw that line in a different place? Because that is where it needs to go.
And I agree with you. I think that's what we need to do is empower. We need to speak up. We need to know that it's okay to speak up. And sometimes, we're not going to win, and that's okay. But I
Mhm.
agree with you. We need to be a community. So I love your words of steel. It actually, when I read it on your LinkedIn, I was like, oh, it just reminds me of a superpower person. It was really impressive. So what are your next exciting opportunities for words of steel?
Yeah, so I just launched Words of Steel a few weeks ago. After my 25 years in corporate, I wanted to have a new challenge. I decided I just want to take that experience and apply it differently, and be able to kind of design what that looks like for me and for clients. So I've been building relationships with agencies and direct to client, working on all sorts of different and really interesting strategic communication challenges, whether it's working on leadership platforms for leaders like yourself, whether it's helping brands on how they show up in the world, or really kind of working through all sorts of different communication challenges and how brands and leaders can have an impact. So I've got some exciting work up ahead, but still really building out relationships and kind of seeing where this goes, and that's a really exciting place to be. So
Awesome.
really thrilled to be kind of in a bit of a fresh space. It's fun.
Which is nice. You're in control of your own destiny. That's always a nice place to be in. So I think I
Yeah,
wish you all the best.
thank you
So if
so
you,
much.
oh, it's very cool. If you were to give your younger self a
Mhm.
piece of advice, if you could have had that, if you could have gone back, what would it be?
Find your people. I think it's so easy to think that you're like one of, and that there's nobody else who's going through what you're going through. And I
Yeah,
think, that to me is where there's such an advantage now, with, all the different social ways to connect, and build it if you can't find it. I think
which is that's awesome. I think I might
yeah.
actually use that. Um, Thank you so much, Miranda, for spending this time with us and sharing your stories with our listeners. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can actually meet in person soon.
I would love that. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me, and I'd love to continue to chat anytime.
Oh, that would be awesome. I think together we can do some great things.
I am confident we can.
You can learn more about today's guests in the show notes and in the powerhouse-project.com. Please follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and thank you so much for listening.